Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. And this week, I wanted to get a little deeper than I have been, and I wanted to talk about a topic that is very close to my heart, and that I know a lot of folks who are coming to either World of Darkness or Chronicles of Darkness games have a bit of trouble with historically. And it's something that I'm assuming you all read the title, so you know why we're here. But today we're going to talk about the H word, which is putting horror in this horror or dark fantasy game. And it's a very easy thing to get wrong, and it's a very difficult thing to get right. So I wanted to offer some insight I've had, talk about some of my experiences, and most importantly, list three big things that I found really work, and three big things which can be kind of a problem if you try to force them in or if you go in blind without really thinking about it. And so this will be the first video I've tried to segment into parts, so bear with me if the technical glitches are a little much. But without further ado, I wanted to get us started with three things you should do when it comes to putting horror in your World of Darkness game. So, what are three important things that you need to do as a storyteller if you want to include horror in your games successfully and in a way that your players will enjoy and that will enhance your chronicle? First things first, you need to ask yourself, what is the theme of the particular game you're playing in the World of Darkness or Chronicles of Darkness setting? And I say this not just in terms of what do you want to do with the story or what genre of game you're running as far as your plot goes, but it's what are the major themes and elements of the particular monsters you're playing with. As I mentioned previously, different monsters have different things associated with them, and you need to sort of include those into your game if you really want to bring it home. For concrete examples of what I'm talking about, if you look at all of the different monsters for the World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness settings, each of them sort of has their own thematic element. Each of them has their own different subgenre of horror that they deal with. For example, if you look at Vampire, both as the stories that it tells and the mechanics in the game, Vampire tends to speak to the desire for the immortal and the horrible consequences of what happens when you get what you want. It deals with the purely mortal attempting to endure both the years and the desires of the immoral and the beastly. And so it's why you have a humanity tracker. It asks, how well are you enduring the scourge of this thing that you have become? How unlike yourself are you becoming over the years? How many parts of yourself have been cut off and left behind? And it's more of a slow boil, but you don't have to do it that way. But those are some of the themes that you deal with when it comes to vampires, of it's the world moving on without you and asking, how do you change to adapt to that if you change to adapt to it? And what does it do to your humanity facing down forever? And you can contrast that with Werewolf, for example. Werewolf doesn't have immortality as an option, but it usually focuses more on body horror and on the idea of the loss of control if one doesn't want to focus on the body horror part. So it's Werewolf's Rage is a perfect example of this. Of that rage could stand in for anger issues, it could stand in for addiction, it could stand in for a lot of things metaphorically. But as a thematic element of the story, it's that question of balance. How much does it take before this rage stops being a weapon you can use, stops being something you can control to fight your enemies with, and it becomes a liability, both for yourself and for those around you? It's that fine balance and that question of, are you the person that should be trusted with, when things start to get out of control? Do you think you know best until someone you cared about winds up on the wrong end of your teeth? And contrast that again with Mage. Lots of people say that Mage is not a horror game. They are wrong, but they may say this if they want to. Mage usually deals with cosmic themes, more intellectual horror. It's less about seeing these beings from the abyss or dealing with demons in that immediate visceral sense like we get with a lot of the monsters, and it's more about that question of hubris, deals with the Frankenstein scenario, if you will, which is ironic because we're not talking about Promethean today. But mages have that question of how powerful can you become before you stop seeing people around you as people? How much until your ego and your hubris begins setting up something that could destroy not just yourself and those around you, but in a very real sense, the world, if you're powerful enough when you make the wrong call. And so it's important to ask yourself what the themes of the game are. They'll be listed in various parts of the book, but ask yourself how those themes fit in not just to the chronicle you're running, the plot that you have, but to the stories that your players are telling and the characters they bring to you. That's going to be the first element of looking and seeing what they have and working with your players to kind of make sure that they're incorporating those aspects so that they fit into the world and everything makes sense and gels nicely. But the second thing sort of builds off of that, and it's atmosphere. The World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness games are nothing without good atmosphere. I would venture to say that at least 65 to 70% of these games is the soup that you're putting all of the crunchy bits in. And so if you don't build that atmosphere, now we just have players walking around in cheap Halloween costumes rather than in, the persona that they have made. And that atmosphere sort of needs to have a back and forth with your players and with the elements that they bring and the things they want to do with their characters. I talked about this earlier when it came to the pageantry of the World of Darkness, and this is where a lot of that comes back around. Atmosphere isn't just bringing in those aspects of the culture and the secret world as they're written out in the books, but this is about really gussying things up. And it's also for folks who are starting to question, specifics and supporting equipment. You don't need to have, noir music going on in the background. You don't need to show up in costume. You don't need to put on a whole bunch of voices. But you need to think about how people are experiencing the world, what kind of portrait you're painting for them, and how that jives with the themes that you had from the first tip that I just gave. As a good example, say you wanted to run a Changeling the Lost game. For folks who are not familiar, Changeling the Lost is a game where normal people are taken by godly entities from another dimension known as the True Fae. The True Fae take you, they rip out your soul, replace it with magic, and then alter you into something else. And then you escape from their service back to the real world, and you find that the world has changed, and you have changed. And so the atmosphere that you would have for a Changeling game is going to be focused on the paranoia surrounding that. It's going to be things like asking whether the stranger who's looking at you on the street seems to recognize you, giving people whiffs of the hedge, letting them listen to like a cry from a back alley market and having a brief flashback and asking, is that a goblin market? Are there more here? Are there people looking for me specifically? Playing into those little areas, setting things up in such a way, it helps them really settle into their characters and settle into the world that you're making for them. And so atmosphere is kind of the immediate effect you get from bringing those themes forward that you need to have in your game. And thirdly, this is assuming you've gotten the previous two done, this will be final execution for this list, and it'll be the tip of the spear when it comes to really bringing home horror in your Chronicles of Darkness or World of Darkness game. And it's that horror has to be personal. Now, up until this point, we've talked about bigger themes, wider themes, things like what should the world feel like, or what elements of the archetypal monster that people are playing should really be present in order to have their players thinking about what's going on and feeling like they're really part of this world. But horror should be a deeply personal thing in these games. It's why you're playing a game rather than watching a movie or reading a book. You should feel that the situations you're coming across affect your character specifically and the actions that you either have taken or have chosen not to take. Again, examples work best for this one. So let's say you have a player who comes to you wanting to run a mage. You're doing a mage game. And so we know the themes of mage. It's hubris, pride, cosmic horror, the question of Do you want to go, how deep into the dark do you want to go to find answers to those questions? What are you willing to sacrifice? How paranoid are you going to get, as mages are very squishy? But then it's that question of, what does this character need personally? What do they want? What do they fear? And so, having those greater issues at play, they might not be phased by, say, an abyssal demon showing up somewhere. They might not be personally involved with a bunch of gore left behind by a ritual that went wrong or things like that, but they might want to do something like the difficulty of holding on to interpersonal connections when you are a mage, for example. And so you can have that thing of, they have something called mage sight, which allows them to see the truth of the world around them, to see through the, I suppose, the superficial nature of reality into the deeper spiritual connection, the supernal of the world around them. And if that's a theme that a player wants to do with this character, keep track of when they use that mage sight. Keep track of who's around when they use it. Because it's one thing to tell yourself, I need to have personal connections, I need to see people, I need to not forget what it's like to be a human being. In that case, you have a very sort of Superman setup of an individual of that much power reminding themselves not to become too detached, not to become too arrogant, not to forget where they came from. But how hard is that to do when you can see the truth of the souls of your loved ones, of your coworkers, of people you might see just casually when you want to go get a coffee at the corner shop that you like? What truths do you see in those people, and what does that motivate you to do about it? Whether you see someone who is being trapped by this dead-end job and desperately needs to get out, if you see someone who's trying so hard to present themselves in a socially acceptable way, but you can see inside of them and you know that's not who they really are, and it's crushing them every day they try to do it. What happens if you look into someone that you loved maybe before you awakened, before you became a mage, and you see that you don't really know who they are, and they're so different than you ever thought? Do you try and change them? Do you try and help? What happens when you try to help and it goes wrong? Providing a lesson on best of intentions can often lead you straight to hell. Those are the kind of things that, as a storyteller, might not fit into the main plot of the chronicle that you're running, but those little touches, making sure that the aspects of those characters' personal involvements, the other NPCs they're connected to, and the actions they take have consequences, that is very important for bringing across horror in a way that doesn't just feel generic. And that is the last thing you want with a game like this. You don't want it to feel like, we got to session 3, now's the time we all look at something horrible, or you read some box text that's supposed to negatively affect you, and then we move on with the game. It should be very, very personal, because that personal touch really brings people in, and it gets people invested in a way that other stuff just won't. But those are my dues. Now, and now we come to the difficult section. I have run a lot of games that have gone poorly. I've been a player in a lot of games that have gone poorly, and I have taken a lot of notes on them. I've written some blog entries, some of which may be below in the description for folks who want additional information on do's and don'ts that may help in Chronicles and World of Darkness games. But these are the things I would recommend not doing if you want your game to go well. First things first, and this was one that a lot of people may have run face first into before, and it's something, if you haven't learned it yet, please let me save you setting your foot in the bear trap. Do not try to actually scare your players. It sounds counterintuitive when it comes to a horror game, as lots of people believe that the point of a horror game should be to scare people. After all, if you're not afraid, what's the point of doing it? And then why not just run something else? And it's that it takes a lot to actually scare someone. Anyone who's ever watched their share of horror movies knows there's a big difference between a cheap jump scare or something that just gives you a momentary thrill and something that genuinely horrifies you. And this is something that a lot of storytellers need to internalize, because it makes their job easier, but it can also frustrate their players a lot. And that's that no one around your table, or if you're doing a LARP setting, no one's actually going to be scared. That's not what you should be trying to do. What you should be trying to do is to build tension. And I say this because tension is often what a lot of us mistake for scares or mistake for horror, because tension is something that can grow slowly. And when you have a serialized format like a tabletop role-playing game, slow ratcheting of tension with regular breaks in between, between the sessions, makes for an overall better experience, because it's something that people can focus on, but it has the effect of, if you remember the story about the frogs in hot water, of if you just take your players and throw them immediately into boiling water, they're going to jump out and ask you what the hell it is you think you're doing. But if you put them in some water that's nice and comfortable and room temperature, and you ask, is everybody comfortable? Okay. And then you up it a degree or two, and then you wait, and everyone adjusts. And you continue on in this way, and they know it's getting hotter, but it's happening so gradually that you get them to the point you wanted them at. But at that point, everyone has buy-in, everyone's invested, and no one wants to leap out. Often to the point where you finally get to hit that pitch boil, and everything goes off the way you wanted it to. So, too long didn't read version of that. Don't focus on anything like jump scares, cheap body horror, disgusting descriptions of things. Tailor those to what you know your table will and won't tolerate, will and won't like, but don't rely on them. That shouldn't be your goal. Your goal should be to increase tension until you reach a point of no return, and then you have your crescendo for whatever the game is, whether it's someone, confronting the final boss or revealing the traitor who's been selling them out this whole time. Any of those things, you need to lead up to them, and then when you get them at the end, it'll feel like the scare was worth it, like you earned it. And that's a thing that a lot of storytellers often forget, or no one's ever told them of. You can't just go straight to the end point of, you need to do the work and build up to it, otherwise your players are just going to jump out of the boiling water. Point number 2, and this is fairly contentious, but it's happened a lot when it comes to World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness games. Some of you out there might already know this, but I feel it is important to mention because it is something that both players and storytellers are very worried about whenever I have this discussion. And it is specifically, do not set out to make your players uncomfortable. And if you see your players getting uncomfortable with something, stop. And I say this very explicitly because a lot of these games were written in the edgier period of the 90s, and the 90s was about pushing a lot of buttons. And there is a element of, it's smaller now, but there's an element of the community that often ridicules people for not being tough enough to withstand particular scenes or not being able to deal with certain aspects. But something that I feel we should all be reminded of is, we're here to play a game and to have fun with our friends. This is not an endurance test. We're not all sitting around seeing who can take more punches to the arm. No one wants to have flashbacks to unpleasant things about their past just to not be laughed at by their friends on Saturday night. We often don't know the history of the people around us at a table, and World of Darkness games can touch on a lot of very, touchy themes. And that can be, though we've been told not to use this word as often because it's been unfortunately turned into a joke by a lot of people, but it can be very triggering for some players, whether it's dealing with things like sexual assault or murder or children being put in danger. We often don't know where the landmines are buried. So, if you feel that your players are being uncomfortable, especially if they tell you that they're uncomfortable with something, stop immediately. But more to the point of, there are tools that I have found very useful, both as a player and as a storyteller. There are essentially consent forms of consent in gaming. I believe it's by Monty Cook Games. Link in the description below for those who don't have a copy. But in the back of it, there is a checklist, essentially, of topics that players can say yay, nay, or contact me beforehand to. Whether it's dealing with spiders or personal assault or being having your character taken somewhere against their will. We often don't know what it is that's going to bother someone, and it is far easier for you as a storyteller and far healthier for your group to have people take 5 minutes to fill out a form beforehand, and for you to read it over and make sure you're not going to do something that is going to upset your players. Because while horror is a thing that is going to make people feel tense, it is a thing that could be perceived as negative. Generally speaking, you want people to feel a catharsis through horror. You want them to feel the same feelings that their character is, and then when the game is over, you want them to be able to let out a deep breath and go, that was really intense, I really enjoyed that, instead of, that was really intense, let's never do that again. And there's a lot of people who get very invested in their own plots and the messages they want to send and the stories they want to tell, whether it's with their characters or as a storyteller with the plot they've made. But it's important to remember that we should be facilitating the fun of everyone around us, and this is explicitly true if you're a storyteller, of it is more important for your players to enjoy their experience with you than it is for you to get to tell that one edgy storyline you've had saved up for a while. And it might be possible that this just isn't the game for that particular player, or that this isn't the table for that particular story. Do not take it personally. It is better to find people that will enjoy that kind of game and who say, yes, run me through that, I want hardcore mode, than to take a bunch of people who are uncertain about it or who have told you, like, no, I don't want to do that, that makes me very uncomfortable, and try to force the issue. Again, it sounds common sense, but it's something that happens a lot. Third thing, and this is a big planting a state of China red flag here. Do not use "but it's a horror game" as an excuse for absolutely anything that goes wrong or that you could say or do in a game. It is my experience that this is the World of Darkness equivalent of a D&D player saying, well, that's what my character would do, so you can't blame me for it. But it's a horror game is not an excuse, because it shows that you have no other justification for what you're trying to do. Because if a player tells you, I don't like this particular kind of plot, or I am uncomfortable with this particular type of arc we're doing, telling them, but it's a horror game, doesn't say anything other than that you, as the storyteller, don't know how to convey horror except in that way that makes one or more of your players uncomfortable. And I say this because there's a lot of folks who get very specific in their minds that horror has to be X, Y, or Z. There are certain players who I've talked to that feel that horror games have to have gore. They have to have extreme body horror. They have to have torture. And because in their minds, if a game wasn't, a hostile lookalike, then it's not a horror game. And I had to explain that that's one very specific subgenre of horror, but that's not horror overall. You can run a horror game with no blood in it at all. And I've had other players who are under the impression that a horror game means characters have to be powerless, players have to have their options taken away from them. And while I will agree that can be a horror game, there's a lot of elements of Call of Cthulhu in that, for example. It's not required for a horror game to do that. And it's one of those things, as a storyteller, you need to have the ability to look at all of the things your players do want and to figure out a way to work with those things to create an experience that is both a horror game, but which is also the kind of horror that they would enjoy and that they will talk about as things go on. Whether they want to have that interpersonal tension, whether they want to have that loss of humanity, whether they want to deal with, the difficulty of someone who has to live with psychological disorders while possessing an egregious amount of power. These are all things that can play into the tropes and themes of horror, but if you are a storyteller or a player, but specifically a storyteller, never lean back on the "but it's a horror game" shield as a defense of something that has upset someone else, or when someone else tells you, I don't want to do this or that aspect. When that happens, you should talk to that person. You should ask, if they're comfortable talking about it, what is it that bothers them about that? Is there another way that you could do this part of the game or this aspect? Or just, do they not want to have their character part of it? Is this really a game that they're not going to gel with? There's nothing wrong with that. It is important to have the right table and the right players for your game when it comes to horror specifically. But this is one of those situations where it's ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. There are a lot of groups I have seen where players or entire tables have left because a game master or a storyteller didn't do their homework and check to make sure that everybody else was as enthused about an idea as they were, or they were worried that by asking permission or getting consent, they would spoil what the twist was going to be. And it is far, far better to give a little spoiler than it is to keep that really close to the vest and have what you expected to be that big moment of your players getting excited being everyone around you just going very quiet and then no one showing up the next time you're supposed to have game. But those are my 3 do's and don'ts. Thank you for coming out this week. I know this video is a little bit longer than intended, but I kind of changed the format up to see whether or not it was something folks liked more of, so let me know in the comments. Do you want to see more lists like this? Do you want to see more deep dives on specific topics? Some folks have made requests before. I've noted them down in my programming book, and I'm researching some of them. So let me know what you want to see going forward, as always. Remember that the link in the description below also has links to all of the World of Darkness and Chronicles supplements by yours truly. I just had my first Geist piece come out, so I'm excited about that, and I would like to keep that going. I very much enjoy that game, but as with everything else, it's going to depend on you all. Let me know what you want to see and what you would like to actually get content for going forward. But until next time, happy gaming, everyone.